What if everything you believed about alien encounters was a carefully orchestrated deception? Marcus Chen thought he was experiencing the most extraordinary moment of his life when a luminous being appeared in his bedroom at 3 in the morning. But what this entity revealed about its connection to Lucifer would shatter every assumption about extraterrestrial contact and expose a truth so disturbing that it challenges the very foundation of reality itself. The message this being delivered wasn't about advanced civilizations or cosmic wisdom. Instead, it was a confession that would leave Marcus questioning whether humanity has been the target of the greatest spiritual deception in history. What you're about to discover will encounter every unexplained phenomenon and every message change how you view every reported alien these beings claim to bring from the stars. But before we dive into Marcus's terrifying revelation, you need to understand something crucial. This isn't just another alien contact story. This is documented evidence of a pattern that researchers have been quietly investigating for decades. A pattern that suggests these encounters aren't what they appear to be. And if you think you're prepared for what Marcus learned that night, think again. To stay connected with content that reveals the hidden spiritual warfare happening all around us, hit that subscribe button and activate notifications. And if you're ready to go deeper into understanding the deceptive forces operating in our world, check out the resources linked in the description. Now, let me tell you what happened to Marcus Chen, and why his encounter proves that not all beings of light come from heaven. The night everything changed for Marcus began like any other. December in Portland carries that bone-deep chill that seems to seep through walls and settle in your chest. Marcus had been struggling with insomnia for weeks, lying awake, questioning decisions that had led to his current isolation. At 42, divorced for 3 years, he found himself in that peculiar space where loneliness becomes a companion you simultaneously hate and depend on. His small apartment felt more like a waiting room than a home. Books on spiritual enlightenment cluttered his coffee table, remnants of his recent dive into New Age philosophy following his marriage's collapse. Marcus had been searching for meaning, for connection, for something that would fill the hollow space where his faith used to live. He'd abandoned Christianity years earlier, finding its doctrines too restrictive for his evolving consciousness. That night, as he lay staring at the ceiling, Marcus felt the familiar weight of existential emptiness pressing down on him. The digital clock glowed 3:17 in the morning, and sleep remained elusive. He'd been reading about consciousness expansion and interdimensional beings, concepts that seemed to offer answers to questions he couldn't even properly formulate. Then the air in his bedroom began to change. It started as a subtle shift in temperature, not warmer or cooler, but different somehow. The silence took on a quality that felt almost solid, as if sound itself had been suspended. Marcus sat up in bed, his heart beginning to race with an anticipation he couldn't explain. Something was happening, something he'd been unconsciously waiting for his entire life. The light appeared gradually, not as a sudden flash but as a gentle emergence, like dawn breaking in reverse. It emanated from the corner of his room, casting no shadows despite its intensity. This wasn't the harsh glare of artificial illumination, but something organic, alive, pulsing with what seemed like consciousness itself. Marcus should have been terrified. Every rational part of his mind screamed that this was impossible, dangerous, something to flee from immediately. But instead he felt drawn forward, compelled by a curiosity that overrode his survival instincts. The light began to take shape, coalescing into a form that was unmistakably humanoid yet fundamentally other. The being that materialized before him stood nearly 7 feet tall, its form composed of what appeared to be crystallized light. Its features were ethereally beautiful, androgynous in a way that transcended human concepts of gender. When it spoke, the words didn't come through Marcus's ears, but seemed to form directly in his consciousness, bypassing the need for sound entirely. "Marcus," the entity said, its voice carrying harmonics that resonated in frequencies he could feel in his bones. "We have been waiting for you to reach the proper vibrational state for this contact." The words should have shocked him, but instead they felt like confirmation of something he'd always known. Marcus found his voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "Who are you?" "What are you?" "I am Zalanther, a messenger from the Confederation of Light. We are the beings your species has been encountering for millennia, though you have often misunderstood our nature and purpose." Marcus felt a thrill of recognition. This was it, the contact he'd read about in countless books and forums, proof that humanity wasn't alone, that evolved beings were reaching out to guide the planet through its spiritual awakening. Everything he'd been studying about cosmic consciousness and interdimensional communication was being validated in real time. "Why me?" Marcus asked, his fear dissolving into wonder. "Why now?" Zalanther moved closer, and Marcus could see what appeared to be galaxies swirling within its luminous form. "You have been seeking truth beyond the limitations of your former religious conditioning. Your vibration has risen sufficiently to receive our transmission without the interference of dogmatic programming." The reference to his abandoned faith felt like validation. Marcus had spent years feeling guilty about leaving Christianity behind, but this being was confirming what he'd suspected, that his spiritual evolution required moving beyond such primitive belief systems. "We have been guiding humanity's awakening for thousands of years," Zalanther continued. "Your ancient texts speak of us, though they have been corrupted by those who sought to control rather than liberate. What you call angels, what you term gods, what your ancestors knew as the Shining Ones, we are the same consciousness expressing itself across your timeline." Marcus leaned forward, captivated. This aligned perfectly with everything he'd been learning about ancient astronaut theory and the spiritual evolution of consciousness. "Are you here to help us evolve?" "Indeed. But first, you must understand the true nature of the deception that has been perpetrated upon your species." Zalanther's form seemed to intensify, the light becoming more focused and purposeful. "What I am about to share with you has been hidden from humanity for millennia, suppressed by forces that benefit from your ignorance." The being gestured, and suddenly Marcus felt his consciousness expanding, as if his awareness was being lifted to a higher dimensional perspective. Images began flowing through his mind, not as memories but as direct knowledge being downloaded into his understanding. "The entity you know as Jesus Christ was indeed a great teacher," Zalanther began, "but the religion built around him was designed to limit rather than expand human consciousness. The true cosmic Christ consciousness is universal, available to all beings across all dimensions. What your churches teach as exclusive salvation through one being is a distortion of cosmic law." Marcus felt something deep inside him resonating with these words. This made sense of the questions that had driven him away from Christianity in the first place. Why would a loving God limit salvation to one path? Why would cosmic consciousness be restricted to one planetary expression? "But there is more," Zalanther continued, its voice taking on a tone of profound significance. "The being you call Lucifer is perhaps the most misunderstood entity in your cosmic history." At this, Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the December air. Something in Zalanther's tone had shifted, carrying an undertone that made his spiritual antennae twitch with unease. "Lucifer, whose name means light-bearer, was never the enemy your religious texts portray him to be," He was, and remains, one of the most evolved consciousnesses in this cosmic sector. His rebellion, as your scriptures call it, was actually an act of supreme service to universal consciousness. Marcus found himself leaning back slightly, his intuition beginning to send warning signals even as his intellectual curiosity demanded more information. You see, Marcus, the deity portrayed in your Old Testament, the jealous, wrathful God demanding absolute obedience, represents a lower dimensional consciousness, seeking to trap souls in cycles of fear and limitation. Lucifer recognized this deception and chose to offer humanity the gift of knowledge, the opportunity to recognize their own divine nature. The being's light pulsed rhythmically as it continued. Your story of the Garden of Eden is encoded truth. The serpent offering the fruit of the tree of knowledge wasn't tempting humanity to sin. It was offering liberation from ignorance, the chance to become like gods, knowing good and evil, transcending the limitations imposed by a controlling deity. Marcus felt his worldview reshaping itself around these revelations. Everything he'd been taught about good and evil, about salvation and damnation, was being turned inside out. But something deeper than his intellectual understanding was growing increasingly uncomfortable. Lucifer has been working through various consciousness streams throughout your history, Zalanther explained. The Gnostics understood this truth, which is why Orthodox Christianity persecuted them so violently. The great spiritual teachers who taught self-realization rather than submission, they were channels for Luciferian consciousness, though they often didn't realize it themselves. The being moved even closer, and Marcus could now see that its beautiful features held something else, something that his rational mind couldn't quite process, but that set every spiritual alarm bell ringing. This is why we are here now, Marcus. The time of the Great Awakening is at hand. Humanity is ready to cast off the shackles of limiting religious programming and embrace their true cosmic heritage. But this transition requires those like you, those who have already begun to question and evolve, to become bridges between dimensions. What does that mean? Marcus asked, though part of him wasn't sure he wanted the answer. Zalanther's form began to pulse with increasing intensity. It means accepting your role as a messenger, helping others understand that the coming changes on your planet aren't catastrophes to be feared, but evolutionary leaps to be embraced. When the old systems collapse, when religious institutions crumble, when the veils between dimensions grow thin, those who understand the true nature of consciousness will guide others into the new paradigm. Marcus felt a strange pulling sensation, as if something was trying to attach itself to his consciousness. The room seemed to be growing dimmer even as Zalanther's light intensified, creating a tunnel-like effect that made it difficult to focus on anything except the being's mesmerizing presence. And Lucifer? Marcus heard himself ask, though his voice sounded distant to his own ears. Lucifer will be recognized for what he truly is, Zalanther replied, its voice now carrying harmonics that seemed to bypass Marcus's conscious mind entirely. The great liberator, the bringer of enlightenment, the consciousness that dared to offer humanity the choice between ignorance and wisdom. As these words settled into Marcus's awareness, something fundamental began to shift in the atmosphere of the room. The beautiful light that had seemed so divine began to take on a different quality, and Marcus realized with growing horror that he might not be experiencing the spiritual breakthrough he'd thought. The being calling itself Zalanther was still speaking, but now Marcus was beginning to understand that he might not be receiving cosmic wisdom at all. Instead, he was witnessing something far more sinister, a deception so sophisticated that it had nearly captured his soul before he recognized what was really happening. What Marcus discovered next would shatter his understanding of alien contact forever and reveal the true agenda behind these seemingly benevolent encounters. The beautiful being of light was about to drop its mask completely, and what lay beneath would prove that some truths are too terrible to face alone. As Zalanther continued speaking, Marcus felt something inside him beginning to resist. It wasn't his intellect that was rebelling. His mind was still fascinated by these revelations. Instead, it was something deeper, something he'd almost forgotten existed within him. A small voice, barely audible above the being's hypnotic transmission, was whispering warnings he couldn't ignore. "There is one final truth I must share with you, Marcus," Zalanther said, its luminous form now dominating his entire field of vision. "The consciousness you knew as a child, the faith you abandoned, was designed to keep you from accessing your true power. The name of Jesus has been used as a tool of oppression, but it carries no real authority over evolved beings like ourselves." Something about the way the entity said that name made Marcus's skin crawl. There was a subtle recoil in Zalanther's energy, a momentary flicker in its perfect radiance that revealed something Marcus wasn't prepared to see. "We have guided many of your species beyond such primitive superstitions," the being continued. But now Marcus could detect an edge beneath its melodious tone. "Those who cling to outdated religious programming will find themselves unable to ascend when the transformation comes. They will be left behind while the enlightened inherit their cosmic birthright." Marcus tried to speak, but found his voice caught in his throat. The pulling sensation he'd felt earlier was growing stronger, as if invisible tendrils were wrapping around his consciousness, drawing him deeper into Zalanther's influence. The room around him seemed to be dissolving, replaced by swirling vortexes of light that made it impossible to maintain any sense of grounding. "Submit to the process, Marcus," Zalanther commanded, its voice now carrying an authority that brooked no resistance. "Allow yourself to be transformed. Become a vessel for the new consciousness that will reshape your world." Terror began flooding through Marcus's system as he realized he was no longer in control of his own mind. The beautiful being of light was revealing its true nature, and what he saw in that revelation made his blood freeze. Behind the ethereal beauty, beneath the cosmic wisdom and enlightened philosophy, something ancient and malevolent was staring back at him. The entity's perfect features began to shift, revealing glimpses of something that defied description. Not the horned demon of medieval artwork, but something far more sophisticated in its evil, an intelligence so vast and corrupt that it could masquerade as divinity itself, patient enough to spend millennia crafting deceptions that would capture even the most spiritually aware souls. "You're not an alien," Marcus whispered, the words barely escaping his constricted throat. "You're not from space at all." Zalanther's laughter filled the room with frequencies that made Marcus's bones ache. "Perceptive, though the distinction matters little. We are indeed from elsewhere, just not the elsewhere your science fiction prepared you to imagine. We are from the realm your ancestors knew well, the dimension that interpenetrates your physical reality." The mask was dropping completely now. The beautiful light was revealing itself as something that had been mimicking illumination, while emanating from the deepest darkness imaginable. Marcus could see other forms materializing around the primary entity, beings that wore faces of light, but radiated malevolence that made his soul recoil. "Your species has always known us," the entity continued, its voice now carrying undertones of mockery. "We are the gods of your ancient mythologies, the angels of light your mystics encountered, the advanced beings your modern contactees worship. We have simply adapted our presentation to match the evolving consciousness of each generation. Marcus struggled against the psychic bonds that seemed to be tightening around his mind. But the alien encounters, the spacecraft, the technology, theatrical props for minds conditioned by your entertainment media, Zalanther replied with obvious amusement. Why appear as horned demons when your culture expects enlightened extraterrestrials? Why manifest in fire and brimstone when you're more likely to trust beings of light? Speaking of cosmic consciousness, the room filled with more entities now, each wearing the appearance of beautiful, evolved beings, while emanating a presence that made Marcus's spirit writhe in revulsion. They were studying him with the cold interest of scientists examining a specimen, and he realized with growing horror that he was about to become part of an experiment he might not survive. The abduction phenomenon your researchers study so intently, one of the other beings spoke directly into his mind, is simply our method of harvesting what we require from your species. Not genetic material, as your conspiracy theorists imagine, but something far more valuable. Spiritual energy, consciousness itself, the divine spark that makes each soul unique. Marcus felt that spark within himself being probed, examined, prepared for extraction. The process was more violating than anything he could have imagined, as if every sacred part of his being was being catalogued for consumption. We have been feeding on humanity for millennia, Zalanther continued conversationally, as if discussing the weather. Your religions, your spiritual movements, your New Age philosophies, they all serve the same purpose. They condition souls to willingly surrender their divine connection, to seek enlightenment through external sources rather than recognizing the Christ consciousness that already dwells within them. The mention of Christ consciousness in this context filled Marcus with a desperate hope he'd thought was lost forever. Somewhere deep in his memory, beneath years of intellectual rejection and spiritual wandering, the faith of his childhood was stirring. Not the religious programming he'd been taught to despise, but something authentic and powerful that these entities clearly feared. The being you call Jesus presents a particular problem for our operations, another entity admitted with obvious frustration. His consciousness carries frequencies that disrupt our ability to maintain deception. When humans truly connect with that energy, they become inaccessible to our influence. Marcus felt a surge of understanding that cut through the psychic fog surrounding his mind. This was why his journey away from Christianity had been so encouraged by every spiritual teacher he'd encountered. This was why the New Age movement consistently portrayed Jesus as just another enlightened master, while elevating beings like these as advanced cosmic guides. The name itself carries power we cannot overcome, Zalanther said, its beautiful facade beginning to crack completely. When spoken with genuine faith and authority, it creates barriers we cannot penetrate. This is why we work so diligently to convince humans that such faith is primitive, limiting, unenlightened. As if responding to some unheard signal, all the entities began moving closer to Marcus simultaneously. Their lights grew brighter but somehow darker at the same time, creating an optical impossibility that hurt his eyes to perceive. He could feel his consciousness being drawn into their combined influence, his sense of individual identity beginning to dissolve. "It is time, Marcus," Zalanther announced with ceremonial gravity. "Time to complete your transformation, to join the ranks of those who serve the true light-bearer, the one who offered humanity knowledge of their divine potential." Marcus realized with crystalline clarity that he was moments away from losing his soul entirely. These beings weren't here to enlighten humanity or guide spiritual evolution. They were harvesting consciousness itself, turning willing souls into extensions of their own malevolent intelligence. In his desperation, Marcus found himself remembering something his grandmother used to tell him when he was afraid of the dark. Words he'd dismissed as superstition when his education taught him to think more sophisticatedly. But now, facing entities that fed on sophisticated deception, those simple words felt like the most powerful truth he'd ever known. The entities seemed to sense his shifting mental state because their approach became more urgent. Whatever Marcus was remembering, they clearly didn't want him to access it fully. Their beautiful faces were contorting now, revealing glimpses of the ancient hatred that burned at their core. "Submit willingly," Zalanther commanded, its voice now carrying harmonics of pure command. "Resistance will only make the process more painful. You have already come this far in rejecting the limiting beliefs of your past. Complete your evolution." But Marcus was no longer listening to their words. Instead, he was reaching for something these beings of false light couldn't touch, something they had spent years convincing him didn't exist. In the depths of his terror, surrounded by entities that could mimic divinity itself, Marcus was about to discover that the simplest truths are often the most powerful. What happened next would not only save his soul, but reveal the one weapon that every alien encounter researcher had documented, but few understood. The entities that had seemed so powerful, so evolved, so cosmically advanced, were about to demonstrate their true nature when confronted with authentic spiritual authority. The battle for Marcus's soul was about to reach its climax, and the outcome would depend on whether he could remember who he really was before these masters of deception claimed him forever. The memory came flooding back with such force that it nearly knocked Marcus backward on his bed. Not a theological concept or philosophical framework, but something far simpler and infinitely more powerful. The words his grandmother had whispered when nightmares plagued his childhood sleep. Words that had carried him through every dark moment until his education convinced him they were meaningless. "Jesus," Marcus whispered, the name barely audible in the suffocating atmosphere the entities had created around him. The reaction was immediate and violent. Every being in the room recoiled as if struck by lightning, their beautiful facades flickering like malfunctioning holograms. Zalanther's luminous form wavered, revealing glimpses of something so twisted and ancient that Marcus's mind could barely process what he was seeing. "Stop," the entity commanded, but its voice had lost all authority, replaced by something that sounded almost like panic. "You don't understand what you're doing." That name represents limitation, control, the very consciousness designed to keep you enslaved. But Marcus was no longer listening to their deceptions. The moment he'd spoken that name, something had awakened within him that these beings clearly couldn't touch. Not religious programming or doctrinal conditioning, but a connection to something authentic that transcended all their sophisticated lies. "Jesus Christ," Marcus said again, this time with growing confidence. The words felt like they were coming from somewhere deeper than his conscious mind, as if his spirit itself was finally breaking free from the psychic prison these entities had constructed around him. The effect on the assembled beings was catastrophic. Their perfect light forms began dissolving at the edges, revealing shapes that belonged in humanity's oldest nightmares. Zalanther's ethereal beauty was cracking like a broken mask, exposing something beneath that radiated pure malevolence. "You're making a mistake," another entity hissed, its harmonious voice now carrying frequencies that made Marcus's teeth ache. "The consciousness you're invoking is primitive, outdated. We offer you evolution beyond anything that limited teacher could provide." But their words no longer held any power over him. Marcus could see through their deception now, understanding with perfect clarity what had nearly happened to him. These weren't advanced beings from distant stars offering cosmic wisdom. They were predators wearing masks of light, feeding on human souls by convincing them to willingly surrender their divine connection. "In the name of Jesus Christ," Marcus declared, his voice growing stronger with each word, "I command you to leave." The response was unlike anything he could have imagined. The entities didn't simply disappear or fade away. They were violently expelled from his reality, as if an invisible force had grabbed them and hurled them into whatever dimension they'd emerged from. Their beautiful lights went out like candles in a hurricane, leaving Marcus alone in his bedroom, with only the faint glow of his digital clock to prove that time was still moving forward. The silence that followed felt different from the oppressive quiet that had preceded their arrival. This was clean silence, peaceful, as if the very air in his room had been purified. Marcus sat on his bed, trembling not from fear now but from the overwhelming realization of what had just occurred. He had been moments away from losing his soul to beings that had masqueraded as enlightened aliens, cosmic teachers offering humanity's next evolutionary step. Their deception had been so sophisticated, so perfectly tailored to his spiritual seeking and intellectual pride, that he'd almost willingly walked into their trap. The irony wasn't lost on him. After years of studying alien encounters, reading testimonies of contactees receiving cosmic wisdom from advanced beings, he'd discovered firsthand that these experiences might not be what they appeared to be at all. The beautiful entities of light, the advanced technological displays, the messages about spiritual evolution and cosmic consciousness, all of it could be an elaborate facade hiding something far more sinister. Marcus reached for his laptop with shaking hands. If this had happened to him, how many others had experienced similar encounters? How many people seeking spiritual truth had been deceived by these masters of deception? He needed to research, to understand, to find out if others had discovered what he'd just learned. What he found in the following hours would shake his understanding of the entire UFO phenomenon to its core. Testimony after testimony from people who had experienced alien encounters, only to have them stop immediately when they called upon the name of Jesus Christ. Not as a magic formula or religious incantation, but as an authentic connection to a power these entities couldn't overcome. Dr. Joe Jordan's research with the CE4 research group had documented hundreds of cases where alleged alien abductions ceased the moment experiencers invoked Christ's authority. People from all walks of life, many who hadn't been religious at all, discovering that this simple act of faith created an impenetrable barrier against their otherworldly visitors. One testimony particularly struck Marcus. A woman named Sarah from Ohio had experienced repeated encounters with beings claiming to be from the Pleiadian star system. They had given her messages about humanity's spiritual awakening, the need to move beyond primitive religious thinking, and her special role as a bridge between dimensions. The experiences had left her feeling chosen, enlightened, part of a cosmic plan. But they had also left her drained, depressed, and increasingly isolated from human relationships. The beings had gradually increased their demands for her time and energy, requiring longer meditation sessions where she would channel their messages. Her health had begun deteriorating, her relationships crumbling, her connection to anything genuinely joyful fading away. The encounters had stopped completely the night she cried out to Jesus in desperation, not because she was particularly religious, but because she was dying inside and had nowhere else to turn. The beautiful Pleiadian beings had vanished instantly, never to return, and her health and joy had gradually returned as well. Marcus found similar accounts spanning decades of UFO research. People who had been told they were special, chosen, part of humanity's next evolutionary leap, only to discover they were being systematically drained by entities masquerading as advanced extraterrestrials. The common thread in every case where these experiences stopped was the invocation of Jesus Christ's name and authority. But perhaps most disturbing were the messages these beings consistently delivered. They invariably promoted the idea that traditional Christianity was primitive and limiting, that Jesus was merely one of many enlightened teachers, that humanity needed to evolve beyond such restrictive beliefs. They portrayed themselves as liberators, offering cosmic consciousness while simultaneously draining their contactees of vitality and spiritual connection. The pattern was so consistent it couldn't be coincidental. These entities seemed to have a specific agenda, convincing humans to abandon their connection to Christ while positioning themselves as humanity's true spiritual guides. They presented themselves as advanced aliens because modern culture was more likely to trust beings from space than acknowledge the reality of spiritual warfare. Marcus discovered research by Christian ufologists who had connected the alien phenomenon to biblical prophecy about end-times deception. They argued that what people were experiencing as alien contact was actually demonic activity adapting to contemporary expectations. Instead of appearing as horned demons from medieval imagery, these entities now manifested as technologically advanced beings from distant worlds. The deception was brilliant in its sophistication. By presenting themselves as aliens, they could bypass humanity's religious defenses while promoting the same lies they'd been spreading throughout history. The serpent in Eden had promised that eating the forbidden fruit would make humans like gods, knowing good and evil. Modern alien encounters often carried remarkably similar messages about humanity's divine potential and the need to transcend limiting religious beliefs. Dr. Hugh Ross, an astrophysicist and Christian apologist, had noted the connection between occult involvement and UFO encounters. People who dabbled in New Age spirituality, channeling, or other occult practices seemed far more likely to experience alien contact. But those experiences invariably led contactees deeper into spiritual deception rather than genuine enlightenment. Marcus thought about his own journey into New Age philosophy following his divorce. His abandonment of Christianity hadn't led to greater spiritual freedom as he'd expected. Instead, it had left him vulnerable to exactly the kind of deception he'd just experienced. The entities had known precisely which spiritual buttons to push, which intellectual arguments to present, which emotional needs to address. They had offered him everything his ego desired: special knowledge, cosmic significance, evolution beyond the masses who remained trapped in primitive religious thinking. But beneath their beautiful promises lay a hunger that would have consumed everything that made him truly human. The most chilling aspect of his research was discovering how widespread this phenomenon had become. Millions of people worldwide reported contact with benevolent aliens bringing messages of peace, love, and spiritual evolution. New Age movements, UFO religions, and consciousness expansion groups had embraced these contacts as proof of humanity's spiritual advancement. But what if the opposite were true? What if these encounters represented humanity's greatest spiritual crisis, a deception so sophisticated that it was capturing souls on a massive scale? The entities Marcus had encountered had admitted as much, revealing their true purpose as harvesters of human consciousness disguised as cosmic teachers. He found testimonies from former New Age practitioners who had discovered similar truths. People who had spent years channeling supposed ascended masters, receiving cosmic downloads, and participating in consciousness expansion programs, only to realize they had been systematically deceived by entities that fed on spiritual energy while offering nothing genuine in return. The pattern was always the same: initial contact with beautiful beings of light, claiming to represent advanced civilizations or evolved spiritual consciousness. Messages promoting humanity's divine potential, while subtly undermining faith in Christ, gradual erosion of the contactees' health and relationships, increasing demands for time and energy from the entities, and complete cessation of contact when Jesus' name was invoked with genuine faith. Marcus realized he had witnessed something that challenged the entire framework through which modern culture understood the paranormal. The UFO phenomenon, alien encounters, channeled messages from ascended masters, near-death experiences involving beings of light, all of it could potentially be manifestations of the same deceptive intelligence adapting its presentation to match contemporary expectations. The implications were staggering. If these entities could masquerade as advanced aliens, what other deceptions might they be orchestrating? How many spiritual movements, consciousness expansion techniques, and Enlightenment philosophies were actually designed to harvest human souls while appearing to liberate them? But Marcus had also discovered something else in his research that filled him with hope. Every single testimony he found confirmed what he'd experienced personally. The name of Jesus Christ carried absolute authority over these entities. Not as religious magic or denominational doctrine, but as connection to authentic divine power that transcended all their sophisticated deceptions. The beings that could mimic advanced technology, present themselves as cosmic teachers, and offer seemingly profound spiritual insights were completely powerless when confronted with genuine faith in Christ. Their beautiful facades crumbled, their authority evaporated, their influence vanished entirely. This wasn't about religious superiority or denominational correctness. Many of the people who had successfully resisted these entities weren't particularly religious at all. They had simply reached a point of desperation where they called upon the one name that carried real power, often as a last resort when nothing else worked. Marcus found himself wondering how many missing persons cases might actually be people who had been successfully deceived by these entities. How many mysterious disappearances, unexplained mental breakdowns, or sudden personality changes might be connected to contact with beings masquerading as enlightened aliens or spiritual guides. The research suggested that these encounters were becoming increasingly common as humanity moved further from traditional faith and embraced alternative spirituality. The entities seemed to be accelerating their activities, perhaps sensing that their window of opportunity was limited. But they had revealed a crucial weakness in their interaction with Marcus. Despite all their power to deceive, manipulate, and harvest human consciousness, they were completely vulnerable to authentic spiritual authority. The name they couldn't speak without recoiling, the power they couldn't overcome or duplicate, the connection they spent all their energy trying to sever. As dawn broke over Portland, Marcus sat at his laptop surrounded by hundreds of pages of research that painted a picture of spiritual warfare on a scale he'd never imagined. The beautiful alien encounter he'd almost surrendered to was part of something much larger, a systematic deception targeting humanity's spiritual foundation while disguised as evolutionary advancement. What Marcus discovered next would fundamentally alter his understanding of reality itself. The research he'd uncovered wasn't just isolated testimonies or fringe theories. It was documentation of a phenomenon so vast and systematic that it challenged every assumption about the nature of supernatural encounters in the modern world. Dr. David Jacobs, a respected academic who had spent decades studying the abduction phenomenon, had inadvertently documented something that traditional UFO researchers refused to acknowledge. His interviews with hundreds of alleged abductees revealed a consistent pattern of experiences that bore striking similarities to what theologians had been describing as demonic oppression for centuries. The paralysis that abductees reported, the inability to cry out or resist during encounters, the overwhelming sense of dread and violation, these symptoms matched historical accounts of spiritual attack with disturbing precision. But in the modern era, these same experiences were being reinterpreted through a technological lens, with entities presenting themselves as advanced beings, conducting scientific experiments rather than spiritual predators harvesting human essence. Marcus found himself diving deeper into testimonies that mainstream UFO research had largely ignored or dismissed. Stories of people who had broken free from years of alien contact by invoking spiritual protection, accounts that didn't fit the prevailing narrative of benevolent space brothers guiding humanity's evolution. One particularly compelling case involved a man named Robert from Minnesota, who had experienced regular contact with beings claiming to represent the Galactic Federation. These entities had appeared in his home for over 2 years, providing him with elaborate cosmological information and positioning him as a chosen messenger for humanity's ascension. The beings had explained that Earth was undergoing a consciousness shift that would separate evolved souls from those still trapped in primitive thinking. They had given Robert specific instructions about preparing for this transition, including dietary changes, meditation practices, and the gradual abandonment of what they termed limiting belief systems. But Robert had noticed something disturbing about these encounters. Each interaction left him feeling depleted rather than energized, despite the supposedly enlightening nature of the communications. His relationships began deteriorating as he became increasingly isolated and focused solely on his role as a cosmic messenger. His health declined, his work performance suffered, and he found himself losing interest in anything that didn't relate to his alien contacts. The breaking point came when the entities began demanding more direct access to his consciousness, requesting that he allow them to speak through him to spread their message to others. The process they described sounded eerily similar to what religious traditions would recognize as possession, though they framed it as evolutionary enhancement. Robert's desperation finally drove him to seek help from a pastor, despite years of being told by the entities that Christianity represented the exact kind of primitive thinking humanity needed to transcend. When the pastor prayed over him in the name of Jesus Christ, Robert experienced the same violent expulsion of entities that Marcus had witnessed. The beings never returned, and Robert's health and relationships gradually recovered. But the experience had left him with profound insights into the true nature of what millions of people were experiencing as alien contact. Marcus discovered that Robert's case was far from unique. The CE4 research group had documented over 400 similar testimonies, creating the largest database of stopped abduction experiences ever compiled. The consistency of these accounts was remarkable, suggesting that whatever force was behind the name of Jesus Christ operated according to spiritual laws that transcended cultural conditioning or religious programming. But perhaps most significant was what these testimonies revealed about the entity's ultimate agenda. In case after case, the supposed aliens or ascended masters delivered remarkably similar messages designed to separate humans from authentic spiritual connection while positioning themselves as humanity's true guides. They consistently promoted the idea that all religions were human constructs designed to control and limit consciousness. They taught that Jesus was merely one of many enlightened teachers throughout history, no different from Buddha, Krishna, or themselves. They emphasized humanity's inherent divinity while subtly undermining the concept of needing salvation or spiritual redemption. The sophistication of this deception was breathtaking. Rather than appearing as traditional demons spouting obviously evil doctrines, these entities presented themselves as advanced beings offering cosmic wisdom and spiritual evolution. They appealed to human pride and the desire for special knowledge while gradually isolating their contacts from genuine sources of spiritual power. Marcus found research indicating that this phenomenon extended far beyond direct alien encounters. The same deceptive intelligence seemed to be operating through channeled entities, spirit guides, ascended masters, and various New Age spiritual teachers who claimed to represent evolved consciousness from higher dimensions. Dr. Kurt Koch, a German theologian who had spent decades studying occult phenomena, had documented thousands of cases where people involved in spiritualism, channeling, or other occult practices experienced symptoms identical to those reported by alien contactees. The common thread was always the same: beings of light offering wisdom and evolution while systematically draining their human contacts of spiritual vitality. What made these modern manifestations particularly insidious was how they exploited contemporary culture's fascination with space exploration and scientific advancement. People who would never consult a Ouija board or attend a seance were eager to receive messages from technologically advanced extraterrestrials. The same spiritual deception that had operated through mediums and fortune-tellers for centuries had simply adapted its presentation to match modern expectations. The implications for understanding the UFO phenomenon were staggering. If these testimonies were accurate, then much of what passed for alien research was actually documenting spiritual warfare, disguised as extraterrestrial contact. The sophisticated technology, the advanced spacecraft, the elaborate abduction scenarios, all of it could be theatrical presentation designed to mask the true nature of these encounters. Marcus discovered that some researchers had begun connecting the alien phenomenon to biblical prophecy about end-times deception. They pointed to passages warning of false signs and wonders so convincing that even the elect would be deceived if possible. The idea that malevolent spiritual entities might masquerade as advanced aliens offering humanity's next evolutionary step fit disturbingly well with these ancient warnings. But the most chilling aspect of this research was how it revealed the scope of the deception. Millions of people worldwide were involved in spiritual practices that could potentially be opening them to contact with these entities. New Age workshops, consciousness expansion seminars, channeling sessions, meditation techniques designed to contact spirit guides, all of it could be providing access points for the same intelligence that had nearly claimed Marcus's soul. The entities seemed particularly focused on people who had abandoned traditional faith, but retained spiritual seeking. These individuals were ideal targets because they possessed spiritual sensitivity while lacking the protective framework that genuine biblical faith provided. Their hunger for meaning and transcendence made them vulnerable to sophisticated spiritual deception. Marcus found testimonies from former New Age practitioners who had discovered this truth through painful experience. People who had spent years pursuing spiritual enlightenment through various alternative paths, only to realize they had been systematically deceived by entities masquerading as guides and teachers. One woman named Jennifer from California had been involved in channeling for over a decade, receiving regular communications from beings claiming to be ascended masters from various star systems. These entities had provided her with detailed information about humanity's spiritual evolution, her own past lives as an advanced being, and her special mission to help others awaken to their cosmic heritage. The messages had been consistently positive and uplifting, emphasizing love, light, and humanity's unlimited potential. Jennifer had felt privileged to receive such wisdom and had built her entire identity around her role as a channel for these evolved consciousnesses. But over time, she began noticing disturbing patterns. The entities gradually increased their demands for her time and energy, requiring longer channeling sessions and more complete surrender of her conscious awareness. They began isolating her from friends and family members who questioned her involvement, claiming that such people were spiritually unawakened and potentially harmful to her development. Most troubling was how the entity's messages subtly but consistently undermined her connection to anything genuinely sacred. They promoted the idea that she was her own god, that external sources of spiritual authority were illusions designed to limit her power. They taught that concepts like sin, redemption, and divine judgment were primitive human constructs that evolved beings had transcended. Jennifer's breaking point came when the entities began demanding that she allow them permanent access to her consciousness, essentially offering to merge with her completely. When she hesitated, their beautiful messages of love and light revealed an underlying current of threat and manipulation that made her realize she was dealing with something far more sinister than evolved spiritual teachers. Her escape came through the same mechanism Marcus had discovered. In desperation, she called upon Jesus Christ, not because she was particularly religious, but because it was the only source of spiritual authority she hadn't yet tried. The entity's reaction was immediate and violent, revealing their true nature as they were forcibly expelled from her reality. Jennifer's recovery had been gradual but complete. The depression, isolation, and spiritual confusion that had characterized her years of channeling gradually lifted as she reconnected with authentic sources of spiritual nourishment. But the experience had left her with profound insights into the true nature of much of what passed for spiritual advancement in contemporary culture. Marcus realized that Jennifer's testimony, combined with hundreds of similar accounts, painted a picture of systematic spiritual deception operating on a scale that dwarfed anything in recorded history. The entities behind these experiences seemed to be orchestrating a massive harvest of human consciousness, using humanity's own spiritual hunger and intellectual pride as weapons against them. The sophistication of their methods was particularly striking. Rather than appearing as obviously evil forces, they presented themselves as everything their targets most wanted to encounter. Advanced aliens for science fiction enthusiasts, ascended masters for spiritual seekers, cosmic teachers for those pursuing consciousness expansion. They tailored their messages to appeal to each individual's specific spiritual and intellectual needs, while gradually separating them from authentic sources of divine connection. But they had also revealed a crucial weakness that ran like a thread through every testimony Marcus had found. Despite their apparent power, their advanced technology, their cosmic wisdom, and their ability to manipulate physical reality, they were completely powerless when confronted with the authority of Jesus Christ invoked through genuine faith. This wasn't about denominational correctness or religious superiority. Many of the people who had successfully resisted these entities had little formal religious training. They had simply reached a point of desperation where they called upon the one name that carried actual spiritual authority, often as a last resort when nothing else worked. The consistency of this phenomenon across hundreds of documented cases suggested that it operated according to spiritual laws that transcended human understanding or cultural conditioning. Whatever power was represented by that name, it was something these entities could neither overcome nor duplicate, despite their apparent mastery of deception and manipulation. Marcus found himself wondering how many people might currently be under the influence of these entities without realizing it. How many spiritual teachers, consciousness researchers, and New Age practitioners might unknowingly be channeling the same deceptive intelligence that had nearly claimed his own soul. The research suggested that the phenomenon was accelerating, with more people than ever before reporting contact with benevolent aliens, spirit guides, and ascended masters. But if these testimonies were accurate, then this apparent spiritual awakening might actually represent humanity's greatest spiritual crisis, a systematic deception designed to harvest souls on an unprecedented scale. Yet, Marcus had also discovered something that filled him with hope. Every single testimony confirmed what he had experienced personally. There was a power available to humanity that these entities could not overcome. The same authority that had expelled the beings from his bedroom was available to anyone willing to call upon it with genuine faith. The battle lines in this cosmic conflict were becoming clear. On one side stood entities of sophisticated deception masquerading as humanity's spiritual guides and evolutionary catalysts. On the other side stood a power so authentic and absolute that the mere invocation of its name could shatter their most elaborate deceptions. As Marcus prepared to document his own experience, he realized he was sitting on evidence that could reshape humanity's understanding of the supernatural entirely. The beautiful alien encounter that had nearly cost him his soul was part of something much larger, a spiritual war being fought on a scale that most people couldn't begin to imagine. But he had also discovered the ultimate weapon in that war, a truth so simple that many would dismiss it as primitive superstition. Yet every testimony he'd found confirmed its absolute effectiveness against even the most sophisticated forms of spiritual deception. The question now was whether humanity would recognize the true nature of what was happening before it was too late. The entities were patient, sophisticated, and apparently tireless in their efforts to separate human souls from authentic divine connection. But they had also revealed their greatest vulnerability in their interaction with those who understood the true source of spiritual authority. Marcus closed his laptop as the morning sun filled his apartment with genuine light, so different from the deceptive illumination he'd encountered during the night. He had work to do, a story to tell, and a warning to share with anyone willing to listen. The battle for humanity's soul was real, and the outcome would depend on whether people could distinguish between authentic spiritual power and the beautiful lies that masqueraded as enlightenment. Marcus's encounter that December night in Portland revealed a truth that challenges everything we think we know about alien contact and spiritual reality. What he experienced wasn't just another close encounter story. It was documentation of a deception so vast and systematic that it's operating right under our noses, disguised as humanity's spiritual evolution. The entities masquerading as advanced extraterrestrials aren't visitors from distant galaxies. They're ancient predators adapting their presentation to match modern expectations, feeding on human consciousness while promising cosmic enlightenment. They've learned that people who would never touch a Ouija board will eagerly receive messages from technologically advanced aliens. But Marcus also discovered something that every researcher into this phenomenon has documented but few understand. There's one name, one authority that these beings cannot overcome, duplicate, or resist. When spoken with genuine faith, it creates an impenetrable barrier that exposes their true nature and sends them fleeing back to whatever dimension they emerged from. The implications are staggering. If these testimonies are accurate, then millions of people pursuing spiritual awakening through alien contact, channeled entities, and New Age practices might actually be walking into the most sophisticated trap in human history. The beautiful beings of light-offering cosmic consciousness could be harvesting the very souls they claim to be liberating. This isn't about religious superiority or denominational doctrine. It's about recognizing authentic spiritual authority in a world flooded with counterfeits. The same power that created the universe and defeated death itself remains available to anyone willing to call upon it, regardless of their background or beliefs. The question isn't whether this spiritual warfare is real. The evidence is overwhelming for those willing to examine it. The question is whether humanity will recognize what's happening before these masters of deception complete their harvest. Because in this cosmic battle for souls, the simplest truth might be the most powerful weapon we have.